When I say Fosse, you usually think of something like this, right? Jazz hands, intricate isolation and pelvic work, turned-in feet, usually someone wearing a top hat or a derby. The style is so recognizable, so, stylized, it's natural to send it up.
Fosse, Fosse, Fosse!
Well, a Fosse neck done? You'll have mastered this move when you look like you're trying to rush aboard a subway train while keeping a chocolate cream egg in your beehole.
While many have gone on to emulate and channel the stylings of Bob Fosse, few approach the actual ingenuity of his work. With movie musicals getting a fair amount of attention recently, for better or worse, I found myself going back to several classics of the genre over the last several weeks, including rewatching one of my personal favorites, Bob Fosse's 1979 film, All That Jazz. It's not exactly an underrated film. It's long been cited by critics and filmmakers alike for its artistic achievements.
It's showtime, folks.
And even if you're not necessarily a fan of musicals, All That Jazz is often a surprise while watching, subverting conventions of the genre while also thrillingly engaging in its artifice. The movie is also a fascinating blend of fiction and autobiography, with Bob Fosse putting himself front and center, recreating one of the most difficult chapters of his life on screen. What does Fosse want us to think of his story, of his life, of show business and those who surrender themselves to it? This episode is going to try and answer that, exploring the real-life events that inspired All That Jazz, the movie's fascinating production, and how a project that many dismissed as an ego-driven vanity project stands up today as one of the most original movie musicals ever made. Before we get started, if you're new to Staged Right and want to see more content like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe today. As a primer for discussing Bob Fosse and the making of All That Jazz, I think it's important to get some background on the man himself. Bob Fosse's sensibilities as an artist were very much shaped by vaudeville, though he never actually performed in it himself. In fact, by the time he began training as a dancer in the 1930s, vaudeville was grasping its last sad breath. But many of his teachers were veterans of the vaudeville stage, so from a young age, Bob Fosse would have been familiar with some of the most iconic acts and routines, and the very routine of selling an act became ingrained in him. He cut his teeth as a performer while playing semi-professional gigs in a duo called the Riff Brothers, eventually touring through the burlesque scene of Chicago. His parents either didn't know or didn't want to know about the kind of grimy places and sordid characters their 13-year-old son was performing with. For better or worse, this time would have a lasting influence on Fosse's work, not to mention his own character. After serving in the US Navy during the Second World War, alongside Joseph Papp by the way, Fosse settled in New York City, dancing in various nightclubs and eventually on Broadway. Oh, and commercials, like this one for Camels, which, with Fosse dancing on his favorite brand of cigarettes, is just kind of perfect. After impressing a talent scout, he was signed on as a contract player at MGM, the movie studio that produced what are today considered some of the greatest movie musicals of all time, with talents like Judy Garland, Gene Kelly, and, of course, Bob Fosse's hero, Fred Astaire. But Fosse quickly became frustrated at the studio. His technical skill as a dancer was indisputable, as demonstrated here dancing with Debbie Reynolds in Give a Girl a Break, but he was never given the same regard as others at the studio. Never quite as athletic or charismatic as players like Gene Kelly or Donald O'Connor. His slight frame, quiet persona, not to mention his thinning hair that the studio felt necessitated a toupee, made it even more difficult for Fosse to stand out in the intensely competitive roster at MGM. While filming Kiss Me Kate in 1953, choreographer Hermes Pan gave Bob Fosse the chance to choreograph a brief segment near the end of the movie. Paired with dancer Carol Haney, the sequence runs about a minute, and even in his first time choreographing for the screen, traces of Fosse's signature style are evident even here. The finger snaps, the hunched shoulders, the simultaneously lithe and angular line of the body. It's all there from the beginning. This sequence became a standout of the picture, and would help Fosse land his first job choreographing on Broadway with 1954's The Pajama Game. The clear standout of that musical was the number Steam Heat. Here, Fosse draws from his vaudeville sensibilities, riffing on Joe Frisco's floor routine, full of snake hipping and derby tricks, even traces of Jimmy Durante with his tight little shuffle walk and hacha routine. Fosse's next job choreographing for Broadway, Damn Yankees in 1955, would mark his first collaboration with Gwen Verdon. The two had crossed paths before this back in Hollywood, while Gwen served as choreographer Jack Cole's assistant, occasionally appearing in small dance parts. Like Fosse, Gwen felt lost in the movies, never seen as beautiful or as glamorous as other starlets of the screen, and her dancing was often deemed too sensual for the rigid Hollywood censors. Her luminous, expressive persona would find greater success on the Broadway stage, like in her star-making turn in Can-Can in 1953. Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon's partnership represented a meeting of mutual minds and experiences. Both had navigated physical limitations that made them unique amongst other dancers. Both had performed in burlesque, shared a mutual admiration for Charlie Chaplin. But it was in their own respective creative instincts that they complemented each other. Each made the other one better. Their creative partnership quickly blossomed into love, which was, of course, very awkward, since Bob was married to Broadway dancer Joan McCracken at the time, whose own union had broken up Bob's first marriage to dancer Marianne Niles back in 1951. Through the rest of the 1950s and early 60s, Bob eventually moved into the role of director-choreographer, a dual role that was still novel at this point in the theater, largely invented by Bob's mentor, Jerome Robbins. Shows like New Girl in Town and Redhead would give Fosse space to refine his choreographic style. The pinnacle, at least for this period, was reached in 1966 with the musical Sweet Charity, then considered his most personal artistic work to date. The show, in my opinion, particularly because of its book, doesn't always work, but Sweet Charity does boast some of the most stylistic and iconic musical numbers, not just of Fosse's body of work, but of theatrical history. It would end up being Sweet Charity that got Fosse's start in directing for the screen, or at least in large part thanks to a former dancer of his, Shirley MacLaine, who came attached to the project with Universal Pictures. Despite her Tony-nominated performance, Gwen Verdon wasn't a name in Hollywood, and was reportedly never even considered for the movie. She would resign herself, however, assisting Bob behind the scenes, which must have been a very strange experience indeed. Despite initial optimism from the studio, Sweet Charity was a colossal box office bomb, and after watching it for this episode, it's not hard to see why. Not that it's without its merits. The way Fosse shoots Rich Man's Frug for the screen, for instance, is often thrilling and arguably the movie's best moment. But aside from some standout performances and an eager cast, the overall tone of the film is inconsistent and often bewildering. Fosse would fare much better with 1972's Cabaret. I talk about this movie at length in my episode about Cabaret, so you can learn more about it there. But a smart concept, Fosse's deft direction, and a solid cast, led by Liza Minnelli, made this movie a hit with audiences and critics alike, ultimately earning Bob Fosse an Oscar for Best Director at the Academy Awards. 1973 was a big year for Fosse, actually. Along with his Oscar, he also won Best Director at the Tonys for Pippin, and Best Direction of a Music Special at the Emmys for Liza with a Z, the so-called Triple Crown, an achievement that, as of this video's publication, has yet to be repeated. Riding on the success, Fosse signed on to direct the film Lenny, starring Dustin Hoffman, while also agreeing to direct and choreograph a new musical, Chicago, which was set to premiere just a few weeks after Lenny's release. This is where the story of All That Jazz begins. On October 26, 1974, Bob Fosse went back into the studio with Gwen Verdon for the first time since Sweet Charity. The two had separated back in 1971, though they would never legally divorce. Based on the Maureen Atkins play and its various film adaptations at that time, Chicago had long been a passion project of Gwen's dating back to the 1950s, and part of Fosse's agreement to take it on may have been out of guilt for his chronic infidelity and the dissolution of their marriage. Even as dance rehearsals began, Fosse was still working on the final edit of Lenny, which was scheduled for release on November 11th. With editor Alan Heim, he would work on the film into the early hours of the morning, then take a cab uptown to Broadway Arts Center to rehearse all day. He might hop over to his apartment at 58 West 58th Street to shower, but then go right back to the Brill Building in Times Square to continue editing, all the while fueling himself with Dexedrine and cigarette after cigarette after cigarette to push through the day. Through all of this, it was impossible not to notice Fosse's heavy cough, the kneading of his forearm, the clenching and unclenching of his fist. After the company table read of Chicago on Monday, November 4th, 1974, lunch was called and Fosse got in a cab to see his doctor. He didn't come back. He had suffered the first of 2 heart attacks and was recommended for immediate surgery for a cardiac bypass. Chicago would be delayed for Fosse to recover. Meanwhile, producers downplayed the delay, with Variety reporting that the cause was due to Fosse's exhaustion. Initially, producers had considered contingency plans, which included seeing if director Hal Prince, a friend and sometimes professional adversary of Fosse, would take on the show in his stead, though it was ultimately agreed that they would wait for Bob to recover. The delay would push Chicago out of contention for that year's Tony Awards, and it's interesting to consider another universe where the show competed against musicals like The Wiz, Mac and Mabel, and Shenandoah. As rehearsals for Chicago commenced in March of 1975, many noted a change in Fosse, not just in his tired demeanor, but how he approached the show itself. Fosse biographer Martin Gottfried wrote, "The psychological changes that had been predicted as a result of the operation were beginning to be reflected in the show, a cruelty and morbidness of spirit. The show got much darker, it seemed to composer John Kander. Even though it had been acerbic, there was originally a certain joyous quality. After the heart bypass, he was going for something else than what we had started to do." One such example was the original staging of Razzle Dazzle, which was staged as an enormous orgy, horrifying the producers and composing team. Not that Fosse hadn't done this kind of thing before, where his hedonistic staging of the song With You incensed Pippin composer Stephen Schwartz back in 1972. By the time Chicago made it to Broadway in June of 1975, critics were generally repelled by the deeply cynical musical. Its momentum was also stifled by a chorus line, which had opened at the Public Theater earlier that spring and was about to transfer to Broadway the following month. Co-produced by Fosse's old Navy buddy Joseph Papp, with direction and choreography by another sometimes professional adversary of Fosse's, Michael Bennett. A chorus line, of course, would sweep the 1976 Tony Awards, with Chicago losing in all of its 11 nominated categories. Fortunately for Fosse, he wouldn't have to sit with this loss too long. With old friend, writer Robert Allen Arthur, they were amidst discussions of adapting the novel Ending for the big screen. Written by Hilma Wolitzer, the novel follows a woman's struggles in grappling with her husband's terminal illness. But in true Bob Fosse style, he wanted to overhaul the narrative, seeing the story through the eyes of the dying man. Sam Wasson writes, "Fosse talked Robert Arthur into inventing a new character, a dying patient who wants to go out big, who keeps wanting to rehearse memorable death speeches for his final close-up, but who dies unceremoniously without a word." The character manifested one of Fosse's greatest fears, not death, but an ordinary death. He said, "What'll happen is I'll probably die in some hospital with no glory at all, no theatrics." What's remarkable is that these initial discussions came before Fosse's heart attack, between Lenny and Chicago, which I'm sure didn't help matters in the long run. Most discussions around Fosse's innate fascination with death are usually in retrospect of his hospital stay, and usually in conjunction with All That Jazz's press tour. But if we look at Pippin, for example, the show's grand finale, which was conceived by Fosse, can give us hints that the director's dark preoccupation with death was present even then. A half hour before his operation, Fosse had spoken with Robert Arthur on the phone, saying from his hospital bed, "We sure picked the right subject, didn't we? I'm getting a lot of material here." In the summer of 1976, Bob Fosse and Robert Arthur opted to move away from the themes of Wolitzer's novel to develop the story closer to Fosse's own brush with death. According to Fosse, some 100 tape-recorded interviews were conducted, with virtually everyone involved with the drama. Lenny star Dustin Hoffman, John Kander and Fred Ebb, Cheetah Rivera, Gwen, as well as Fosse's teenage daughter, Nicole. At one point, Bob Arthur sat in on an interview with Bob Fosse's psychiatrist, where he told Bob, "You're very cynical about women. Starting with your experiences in burlesque, you had to prove that every woman is a whore. You cut yourself off from letting yourself be loved. You let yourself be adored, but not loved. Turning to Bob Arthur, the psychiatrist added, Fosse reaches for love, but he doesn't allow himself to find it. You see, Bobby, it all goes way back to the disappointment you had about your ability as a performer, and the constant need to keep proving yourself. What you haven't proved is your lovability. Applause isn't a substitute for being loved. Compiling their notes, they forged out the first draft of the screenplay, with real names included before assigning everyone with an alias. For the title of the film, Fosse thought of the opening number of Chicago, then called up lyricist Fred Ebb in California. From Sam Wasson, "Can I use the song title All That Jazz for the movie? Because it's yours." Actually, it's not. I was reading one of the Time Life book series and there was a chapter entitled All That Jazz. I took it from there. I didn't really invent it, Bob. That impressed Fosse. If there is a line that you take from somebody, he said, you acknowledge it. I never do. The sincerest form of flattery is to steal. One of the key contributions Fosse made to the screenplay was the limbo world of Joe's imagination, referred to in the script as hallucinatory dressing room, which would give All That Jazz's narrative quite literally another dimension. Fosse, of course, had worked with narrative leaps in film before, but this was different. Alan Hyme recalls, for instance, that while Julian Barry's screenplay of Lenny had references to jumps in time and chronology, it was in the cutting room that the film's structure transformed.
When Bob came into the cutting room, we discovered that Dustin, as Lenny Bruce, didn't have an edge. Dustin, like many actors, wants to be liked. The film was structured where there'd be something in his life that led us into the comedy routine. And once we were in the routines, they weren't very exciting. And I said to Bob, why don't we try fragmenting them more?
Like this scene here, where Lenny visits his wife at the hospital following a brutal car accident. In the waiting room, a courteous duty nurse tends to him, checking to see if he needs anything, and then goes back to her station. When some primal inclination creeps over Lenny, the comedy act kicks in.
Let's face it, guys are different. And ladies just don't understand this.
It almost plays the function of a musical number. When the emotion or power of a moment is too overwhelming, it elevates the scene to another plane. Alan Hyme would later say, "We discovered that by fragmenting Hoffman's performance, even more than it had been in the script, we were able to make him seem tougher, to make the film move better." While the intricate storytelling of Lenny had been found during the editing process, All That Jazz was written with it in mind. When Joe needs to reflect, or perhaps escape reality, he retreats deep into his subconsciousness, a subterranean space of relics, old props and costumes, theater sets, and long-forgotten dressing rooms. The space is inhabited by Angelique, a specter that, unlike others, isn't repelled by Joe's dishonesty. Rather, it makes him more attractive. She is, after all, the angel of death, and gradually lures him from the world of the living. The intercutting of past with present, reality with stage performances, truth with deception is something that Fosse orchestrator Ralph Burns referred to as Fosse time. These contrasting worlds dually exist and inform each other. Fosse had dabbled with the so-called limbo world in other movies, even going back to Sweet Charity. When Shirley MacLaine reaches the climax of If My Friends Could See Me Now, Fosse gives her a sprawling expanse of space to perform the number. In both Cabaret and Lenny, the respective clubs, in one sense, are real, but the way they drive the narrative forward and comment on the action are completely separate from the main story. Therefore, the Kit Kat Club and the stages that Lenny Bruce performed from can be considered limbo as well. This isn't to say that Fosse invented the concept. In my episode about the musical, I talk about how Cabaret's limbo world was created by the show's original director, Hal Prince. I can even see an argument that the dream ballets of Agnes de Mille exist in a limbo world of their own, driving the story forward without being involved with the reality of the characters. But I think the way Fosse uses the concept in All That Jazz is both thrilling and unexpectedly poignant. Joe has difficulty being present. He has never, nor can he ever, appreciate the goodness in his life, his success, his devoted girlfriend and daughter, instead retreating to the safety of his limbo world, where all his darkest and unsavory appetites are indulged. To play Fosse's avatar, Joe Gideon, some of the biggest names in Hollywood were considered. Robert De Niro, Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, and Paul Newman were just a handful of the names that were discussed. Richard Dreyfuss, fresh off his Oscar-winning performance of The Goodbye Girl, was initially signed on to take the role, but a quickly souring rapport with Fosse prompted him to leave the picture. About this time, Fosse's agent Sam Cohn reached out to actor Roy Scheider, who, being a close friend of Richard Dreyfuss, knew all about what was going on. After meeting with Fosse several times, Scheider was finally offered the part. Not being a dancer, Scheider was put through rigorous training, becoming a shadow to Fosse's every move, not just in rehearsal, but in life as well. Sam Wasson writes that Scheider's task was to become Fosse, body and soul. Roy was committed, said rehearsal pianist Don Rebick. If he was there during one of Fosse's coughing fits, he'd follow Bob out into the bathroom. Then Fosse would return with a cigarette. Roy too. Fosse worked on Scheider's cough like it was a monologue, bringing him down to a deeper, gutsier hack, his own. The film features early performances from well-known names we recognize now, like Jessica Lange as Angelique, Wallace Shawn as the producer's insurance broker, and John Lithgow as Lucas Sargent, which is basically him doing a Hal Prince caricature. Speaking of Hal Prince, Joanna Merlin, Hal Prince's casting director, who by my calendar was casting Evita about the time of the shoot, appears as one of Joe's nurses, which admittedly is a very random fact, but thought would be fun to share anyway. Cliff Gorman, who had won a Tony for the Broadway production of Lenny, before being passed over to reprise the role in the movie, would end up playing the Dustin Hoffman avatar, Davis Newman, starring in Joe's new movie, The Stand-Up. To cast some of the smaller roles in the movie, Fosse would make unorthodox choices, casting people who were not necessarily professional actors, at times simply playing a thinly veiled version of themselves. All That Jazz's editor Alan Heim appears in the film, basically reenacting the tail end of his time working on Lenny. Many of those working behind the scenes for the original production of Chicago appear in the film as well, including stage manager Phil Friedman, who happens to deliver one of my favorite line readings of the entire movie.
Smoke! Smoke! Smoke!
From Chicago, we also have appearances from lighting designer Jules Fisher, music director Stanley Lebowski, rehearsal pianist and arranger Arnold Gross, and while Tony Walton himself doesn't appear in the film, his maquette of Chicago is a stand-in for the set of New York, LA. Veteran Fosse dancers like Sandal Bergman, Gary Flannery, and Jennifer Nairn Smith appear in the film as well, not to mention Ben Vereen, an alumnus of Sweet Charity and Pippin, who appears as a Sammy Davis Jr. type entertainer, and longtime Fosse dancer and assistant Catherine Doby, who appeared in the film versions of Sweet Charity and Cabaret, plays Joe's assistant, simply credited as Catherine. She also appears in the Bye Bye Life trio at the end of the movie. For the part of Joe's daughter, Michelle, 12-year-old Erzsébet Foldy was hired, then studying at the American Ballet Theater. Fosse's actual daughter, Nicole, makes a brief, and I mean very brief appearance in the film as well.
Would you mind doing that somewhere else?
To play Joe's girlfriend, Katie, Fosse cast his own ex-girlfriend, Broadway dancer Ann Reinking. While others in the movie played avatars of themselves, Reinking got closer to playing herself than anyone else in the movie. By the time All That Jazz was in production, she and Bob were no longer an official item. Jessica Lange had apparently entered the picture about this time. Despite their history, Fosse put Reinking through what producer Dan Melnick referred to as a deliberately nasty audition process. In the screenplay, Katie is one of the more sympathetic characters of the movie, devoted to Joe, nurturing and caring for his daughter Michelle, all the while frustrated with Joe's double standards with fidelity. Along with Catherine Doby and Ben Vereen, she completes the Bye Bye Life trio at the end of the movie. For the part of Joe's ex-wife Audrey, Fosse reportedly initially offered the part to Shirley MacLaine, but perhaps uneasy at the prospect of playing yet another stand-in for Gwen Verdon, she turned it down. The part went instead to Fosse dancer Leland Palmer, which in its own way was a curious choice. She had originated the part of Fastrada in Pippin back in 1972, a role that, in another universe, might have been played by Gwen Verdon. But the original production of Pippin coincided with the beginning of her separation from Bob Fosse. so the role went instead to Leland Palmer, who was given this bright red wig to wear in the show. Thankfully, perhaps mercifully, Leland is not made to look or sound like Gwen in All That Jazz, and the success of her performance is pretty much on her terms. Oh, and it was only after my most recent rewatch of this movie that I caught a picture of Audrey in Joe's apartment, which is really Leland as Fastrada and Pippin. The character of Audrey is cast in a somewhat ambivalent light, at once advocating for Joe's well-being while also directly benefiting from his success. A subtle but key facet of Audrey is her embodiment of the consummate actress. This was often a perception of Gwen Verdon herself, playing face and being strong when the world around is falling apart. Even with the cast assembled, production would be delayed 3 months in order that Roy Scheider could finish filming the neo-thriller Last Embrace. Shooting finally began in October 1978. Arguably, the most iconic scene in All That Jazz is the opening sequence, set to George Benson's live recording of On Broadway, shot on location at the Palace Theater at Broadway and 47th Street. Once the crown jewel of the vaudeville stage, and more crucially to Fosse, the theater that Sweet Charity had played in the 1960s. Fosse apparently told one of his dancers, "I'm going to do in 15 minutes what it takes Michael Bennett 2.5 hours to do every night." With 5 cameras, Fosse decided to film the sequence documentary style, running everything as if it was a real audition. In fact, Catherine Doby is leading the dancers in Fosse's actual ballet combination, his infamous T for 2 combo.
My instructions were to tell them what to do in the dance. And Fosse and I had gone over what those few particular moments were. But now in the grouping of the people, to take them off the stage was something that was not rehearsed.
According to Fosse, many of the dancers here didn't even know if they were going to make it into the later part of the movie, so all the nerves captured on film are authentic. For me, it's the stolen moments of dancers on the sidelines that are the most compelling of the whole sequence, brimming with humanity for these young hopefuls. And yes, this roughly 6-minute sequence probably set a very high bar for the inevitable chorus line movie, which, at least under Richard Attenborough's direction, failed stupendously to capture the show's spirit. Also, I just think it's funny that despite her dad's petty diatribe against Michael Bennett, Nicole Fosse ended up in the chorus line movie. Fosse's unconventional approach to filming this and other dance sequences and All That Jazz are often what make this film so thrilling. It's a far cry from the MGM days that Bob Fosse had come from. Beyond the grand-scale productions of, say, Busby Berkeley, which Bob Fosse taps into here with satiric undertones, many classic movie musicals took cues from Fred Astaire's aesthetic. Full-framed dance sequences, no close-ups, with the camera only moving to follow the performers. But with people like Jerome Robbins coming in to translate their choreography for the screen, as he masterfully does in 1961's West Side Story, the way of filming movie musicals would evolve. Fosse cites this film as one of his early inspirations as a director, as well as 1952's Moulin Rouge, more of a drama with dance than movie musical. Directed by John Huston, the camera is intimately involved with the dance sequences, with close-ups on legs, limbs, highlighting imperfections like smeared makeup and sweat. In his biography of Fosse, Sam Wasson explores Bob's fascination with the unglamorous and the unrefined, how his love of vaudeville and his time in burlesque made the unglamorous more authentic. Gags, rim shots, and whistles, rowdy provincial audiences howling at the acts, and the acts howling back, flimsy machinery, threadbare scenery, a circus rotation of jugglers and dogs. This was his kind of show. It was real, too. High theater concealed what vaudeville's industrial vulgarity always seemed to expose. But Fosse loved that about vaudeville. It seemed to be about show business. As much as its talent, it reveled in its transparencies. In Cabaret, for instance, Fosse uses various camera angles to immerse the viewer into the claustrophobic Kit Kat Club, even letting us view the action from backstage, a perspective Fosse was all too familiar with. Even in Liza with a Z, he subverts the classic television special of the 1950s and 60s, setting a camera at a low angle, as if we were an audience member in the front row of the Lyceum Theater. and even occasionally letting us into the backstage world, however benign it may seem. We are watching a performance, an illusion, and Fosse doesn't want us to forget that. To help bring his vision to the screen, Fosse's agent suggested Italian cinematographer Giuseppe Rotunno. Tony Walton remembered, "For a while, Bob was moving away from Rotunno. The cameraman sometimes struggled with English. But I argued that with so many levels of reality in the movie, hallucinatory, fantasy, memory, naturalism, the one essential that would clarify the finished film for an audience was a strong and confident visual sense." The fact that Rotunno was a frequent collaborator of director Federico Fellini may have also helped in swaying Fosse's decision. Fosse, of course, was well acquainted with Fellini's work, having used 1957's Nights of Cabiria as the blueprint for what ultimately became Sweet Charity. In many ways, All That Jazz feels spiritually connected with Fellini's 1963 film 8½. Some less generous may say it is a ripoff of 8½. Just as Joe is a stand-in for Fosse, Guido is a stand-in for Fellini, an Italian filmmaker struggling with writer's block. Like Joe, he is a work-obsessed serial womanizer who struggles creatively and with his many relationships. Only at the end, in a surreal and dramatic conclusion, do the people of Guido's life come together to help him make sense of it all. The parallels and connections are fascinating. Even how All That Jazz inverts Claudia of 8½, Guido's vision of the ideal woman, into Angelique, in Joe's mind a beautiful woman who is also the angel of death. From the research I had access to, it's not clear just how much, if at all, Bob Fosse and Robert Arthur may have discussed 8½, though Fosse was evidently a fan of Fellini, even saying in a 1972 interview that he imagined Pippin being turned into a Fellini-like movie. Another curious parallel is found with the character of La Seraghina. In 8½, La Seraghina, which was based on a real-life figure from Fellini's childhood, is a local sex worker that, at least as far as I'm aware, proverbially ushers Guido into adult sexuality. The strippers of The Silver Cloud, a real burlesque house that Fosse played as a teenager, in one sense play the same function for Joe in All That Jazz. But here, it's not a graceful initiation into adulthood. Rather, it's aggressive, violent, marred with shame and humiliation. The scene is upsetting, and Fosse means it to be. One of the film's more upsetting and controversial sequences is Joe's bypass surgery, where, with the proper permissions, Fosse filmed an actual procedure.
That's the scene that seems to bother people most, and the thing that I liked about the scene was the counterpoint of that scene, because you don't see that much of the operation. As a matter of fact, I think there's about 13 seconds of it. But it keeps cutting back and forth to these theatrical producers who are finding out from the insurance company that this man, Joe Gideon, the part that Roy Scheider plays, might be worth more dead to them than he is alive, and the slight temptation there is with anything when greed and money is involved. That was the point of the scene.
Sensing the film needed some levity, producer Dan Melnick suggested that Fosse add a new scene to soften Joe's character. A scene that ultimately became Everything Old is New Again. It's easily the film's purest, most joyful moment, with Fosse knowing exactly how to show off Anne Ranking's stellar technique and form. And Erzsébet Foldy is no slouch either, perfectly in sync with Ranking every step of the way. Anne Ranking's most memorable moment for me is here, part of Joe's bypass hallucination in the number There'll Be Some Changes Made. She shows off not just how proficient she was in the Fosse style, but just how wonderfully expressive and articulate she was as a dancer. In true Bob Fosse style, All That Jazz went over schedule and over budget. Originally, the final fantasy sequence of the movie was to be intercut with the opening night performance of New York, LA, under Lucas Sargent's direction, but budget constraints forced Fosse to cut it. With 20th Century Fox now joining Columbia as co-producer, designer Tony Walton had to create Joe's death finale on a shoestring budget. The central platform piece, for instance, had originally been designed by Walton for the 1978 musical The Act, starring Liza Minnelli. In a cavernous, reflective space, Joe envisions his death as a performance, and all the important people in his life, friend, foe, lover, tormentor, even Joe's younger self, are present to send him off. Another parallel that curiously connects All That Jazz's finale with that of Fellini's 8½. Those closest to Joe find themselves part of an audience with various anonymous patrons, some of whom wear heavy makeup that conjures the MC of Cabaret or the players of Pippin. Some, like members of Joe's band, wear metallic silver makeup. When they rise out of the floor in mechanical tableau, the effect is to make it seem like they too are part of the metallic hydraulic set. Thinking of Sam Wasson's quote, how Fosse preferred highlighting simplicity and transparency, it's curious to note his emphasis on artifice here. And I don't think it's incidental that Fosse makes a connection with the mannequin-fashioned gobo lights with the silver-adorned patrons. However we want to give in to a sentimental ending, Fosse ensures that Joe's overproduced finale feels somehow off. This audience is just as much a part of the performance as Joe is, an assembly of glorified seat fillers who either delight in the act or stare back with vacuous looks. The climax of Joe's death finale has him finally succumb to his lifelong flirtation with the Angel of Death, a romantic, idealized end to his life. The reality, of course, is far from romantic. A jarring end that Fosse can't help but give one last wry button to.
There's no business like show business, like no business I know.
All That Jazz opened in theaters in December of 1979 to mixed reviews. Critics praised the cast, particularly Roy Scheider, and commended Bob Fosse's musical numbers, but some found the fragmented story and Joe Gideon's ungainly character a hard pill to swallow. Roger Ebert thought so, though Gene Siskel suggested that was the point.
I couldn't follow it, I couldn't understand it, and I walked out of the theater behind a woman who said, you know, when you go to a musical at holiday time, you don't really expect to see open heart surgery. I think I kind of understand what she was talking about.
So you like the dance and you don't like the story. And you know, that's a common reaction to the picture. And unfortunately, I think that that's exactly what this guy intended, who made the picture, Bob Fosse. He likes the dance, and he doesn't like the story. And the story for him is his own life when he isn't creating dance. So I think that the very reaction you had is sort of the proper reaction.
Some industry members, by now well acquainted with not just the style but the persona of Fosse, were wary of what they saw as a self-aggrandizing ego trip. Though Vincent Canby of the New York Times thought that Fosse was being more critical than praising of Joe Gideon's character, writing in a generally positive review, not even Fellini, Ingmar Bergman, or Woody Allen, all of whom are similarly guilt-ridden, has ever celebrated himself quite so cruelly. Despite mixed reactions from critics, All That Jazz performed well at the box office, going on to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, and being nominated for 9 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Director for Fosse, though Oscar host Johnny Carson couldn't help but take a jab at the movie in his opening monologue.
And I don't think any of us will forget that climactic scene in which he's opened up in the operating room and they discover that his ego has spread throughout his entire body. I'll tell you, if All That Jazz doesn't win any Oscars tonight, Bob Fosse will finally get his death wish.
Fosse would lose that night, as would Roy Scheider for Best Actor, to Dustin Hoffman for Kramer vs. Kramer, by the way. The film, however, did win 4 Oscars that night, notably for Best Art Direction and Best Editing, which went, of course, to Alan Hyme. Fosse was also nominated that night for Best Screenplay, alongside Robert Allen Arthur. Arthur, of course, was not present at the ceremony. Just barely a month into the filming of All That Jazz, he fell ill and, not long after being diagnosed with lung cancer, passed away on November 20th, 1978, in the very same hospital, on the very same floor that Bob Fosse had stayed in just 4 years earlier. All That Jazz would mark a career high point for Fosse that would not be repeated. His subsequent return to Broadway, not to mention his final movie as director, 1983's Star 80, were coolly received. Though his work on the 1986 revival of Sweet Charity did make many critics talk in earnest about the director-choreographer's indelible place in theater history. More than fearing an ordinary life, Fosse feared dying an ordinary death with no theatrics. In a macabre fashion that suited Fosse, he would get his wish. On September 23, 1987, on his way with Gwen Verdon to attend the opening night of Sweet Charity in Washington, D.C., Bob Fosse suffered a massive heart attack, mere blocks from the National Theater, passing away at the age of 60. In the years that followed his death, Fosse's legacy would be bolstered by faithful keepers of his work, including Anne Ranking, who would ultimately help bring Chicago back to the Broadway stage. In the aftermath of trials like O.J. Simpson and the Menendez brothers, this biting satire on crime and justice that had once repelled audiences in 1975 was suddenly a prescient classic. Starting at encores at City Center, the revival of Chicago would transfer to Broadway in 1996, where, as of this video's publication, it is still running. As well as starring as Roxy Hart in the revival's opening night cast, Anne Ranking also choreographed the show in Bob Fosse style, ultimately winning a Tony for her work.
I thank the opportunity to give back. I thank my teachers. I thank the one man who stood up for me so many times. This one's for you, Bobby.
In 2002, the fragmented styling of Bob Fosse and All That Jazz would be key in translating Chicago to the screen. In Bill Condon's screenplay, the musical numbers exist within Roxy's mind, in effect, an extension of the limbo world. Her way of understanding the real world is by way of entertainment. Director-choreographer Rob Marshall expertly harnesses Fosse's fragmented film language in what is widely considered one of the greatest movie musicals ever filmed. Marshall uses the concept again in 2009's Nine, a screen adaptation of the 1982 musical, which is, of course, adapted from Federico Fellini's 8½, which, ironically, translates far less effectively here. In the years since its release, All That Jazz has gone on to be recognized for its artistic accomplishments, as well as its subsequent influence.
It's showtime, folks.
Writer Kevin Winkler cites Richard Pryor's 1986 autobiography, JoJo Dancer, Your Life is Calling, saying that the film, which he directed and co-wrote, builds, quote, on All That Jazz's model of a medical crisis, as a jumping-off point for the comedian to examine his life, past and present. Pryor went Fosse one better by starring in his own story. Director Darren Aronofsky reportedly cited Joe Gideon's morning routine as inspiration for the drug use montage in Requiem for a Dream. And along with editor Sarah Flack, Sofia Coppola interpolated Vivaldi's Concerto in G into Marie Antoinette's morning routines, just as Bob Fosse does in All That Jazz. Sofia Coppola, the daughter of Francis Ford Coppola, the director that went head-to-head with Fosse at the Oscars on 3 separate occasions, actually mentioned Fosse in her 2004 Oscar speech, citing him as one of the filmmakers that influenced her while writing the screenplay for Lost in Translation. While Fosse no doubt had an influence on the stylings of Michael Jackson, there is also a strong case for Fosse's influence on the art form of the music video. The erotica sequence in All That Jazz, that had stunned mainstream audiences in 1979, would be referenced by David Fincher while directing Paula Abdul's 1989 music video, Cold Hearted, which in turn would be referenced again by Ariana Grande in her music video of Yes End in 2024. Some of the initial criticisms All That Jazz received in 1979 have evolved, not necessarily to absolve Bob Fosse of narcissistic tendencies, but to explore what he's trying to say with his story. Fosse does inject himself and his life into the film, but with time and distance, it's easier to accept the film on its own terms, recognizing the humanity of a character that, one could argue, doesn't deserve our sympathy. For those that were closest with Fosse, the film may have still been a hard pill to swallow. Some, like Kander and Ebb, who were represented, perhaps caricatured in Anthony Holland's character, were incensed by the picture, unable to reconcile Fosse's narcissism and hypocrisy. John Kander said of the film, "It was all about Bobby pretending to be honest. He was saying, I'm not worth much, but everyone around me is worth even less. Fred Ebb would say, Bob understood his own meanness, but I don't think he should be forgiven it just because he understood it. It's an immensely complicated issue, and I think it's safe to say that every Fosse collaborator will have their own way of remembering his legacy. Gwen Verdon once said of Fosse, his self-destructive things put him in touch with his talent. It was the way he could be creative. I think, generally speaking, the dialogue around these issues have become far more nuanced. Sam Wasson's excellent 2013 biography of Fosse is a good example of this. While never excusing or pardoning his behavior, Wasson dives deep to understand the roots of Fosse's troubles and the environments that fostered them. Wasson's book would later inspire the 2019 FX series Fosse Verdon, starring Sam Rockwell and Michelle Williams. But even in the short period of time from the release of Sam Wasson's book, the analysis of Fosse's career has become even more focused. In the wake of the Me Too movement, the normalization of Fosse's predatory behavior that he depicts in All That Jazz, has made his legacy even more complicated to deal with. The show attempts to explore this problem with the most peculiar figure at the helm. Nicole Fosse, the daughter of Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon, joined the show as a creative consultant and as co-producer. Her proximity to the show and its frank conversations about her family reveal that she too has had to contend with the legacy of her parents and how it relates to her. She told Vulture in 2019, "As an adult, watching situations and characters from my own experience come to life as drama, it's become clear to me that I've changed my point of view about a lot of stuff I used to normalize. There are times when Bob will act like a jerk in this, but I find him so charming that I get sucked into thinking, well, maybe he didn't really mean it, even though I knew him about as well as anybody, you know? And then the mature woman part of me steps in and says, no, that's not okay. That's hurtful and harmful." The series also complicates the projections in All That Jazz and how Fosse perceived his family. While the character of Michelle appears well-adjusted and unfazed by her unconventional family dynamic, Fosse Verdon suggests that Nicole was far from unaffected. Maybe a sense of betrayal and exploitation from Bob Fosse's daughter was more prevalent than others might have thought. At the same time, the show doesn't feel like some vengeful mommy dearest project, taking instead a thoughtful approach to exploring these figures, though admittedly never as thoroughly as Sam Wasson does in his book. Nicole Fosse told The Washington Post, "I hope that the show spurs conversations about people's behavior, what is right, what is wrong, how to uphold boundaries, and what to do to help people when you see that a really good person is in distress. My father was a loving family man, and then there's this other stuff. He was completely contradictory. It must have been torturous for him. He believed in the sanctity of marriage, but he couldn't do it himself. And that creates self-loathing. I've come to see it as a spiritual split." That spiritual split is what Fosse tries to explore in All That Jazz. Watching the movie in 2025 only affirms the things that I love about it, while also highlighting what is problematic. It's a fascinating, thrilling, sometimes troubling movie about the dark side of show business that feels all the more poignant for its real-life inspiration. I don't think it's a film that should be viewed apathetically or praised merely because a Broadway legend directed it. It deserves discussion, analysis, and, controversial as it sounds these days, a dose of empathy for its lost and misguided characters. Thank you for watching this episode. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You can also support Staged Right in a flexible, affordable way by contributing via my Ko-fi or Patreon accounts. And if you want to enjoy even more Staged Right, you can now listen to the podcast edition, where I recently spoke with Tony-winning composer Adam Gettle about the Broadway revival of Floyd Collins, as well as Izzy of the hit YouTube channel Be Kind Rewind, where we talked about movie musicals. You can find episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.